Hello, everyone. My name is Champaka Rajagopal. I am a faculty member here at Azim Premji University. I teach urban governance and planning. We're delighted to have here with us today Mr. Kumaresh Mishra and Lavanya Saxena on a conversation on India since independence, essays on transformation and permanence. Mr. Kumaresh Mishra has been Deputy Secretary General of Habitat 3, which was held at Quito in 2016. And Lavanya is an urban policy professional. She has a master's degree from the National University of Singapore, and she's just launching her career in the space of urban, in the space of policy and governance. So welcome, hearty welcome to both of you to Azim Premji University. We have a range of important questions that are confronting urban governance. The conversation here with us today is pertaining to urban governance in India. One of the key questions that is ahead of us is rapid urbanization in India and sustainable development. So could I solicit your thoughts on this sort of a tension that exists between rapid urbanization and how to steer inclusive as well as environmentally sensitive urban development over the course of the next several decades to come?
Thank you, Champak. It's such a pleasure to be here at the Azim Premji University. It's a privilege and an honor to come here to talk about urbanization. And the placement and starting of this university at this location is also indicative of the progress of urbanization and the challenges of urbanization. I recall being in Bengaluru almost 30 years back. It was a green city.
Indeed.
It was, apart from the main road, much of the traffic was manageable. The distances were much less. And now we have a big, sprawling, modern Bengaluru, with its high-rise buildings and others. And therefore, that is the challenge and issue of urbanization that is happening in India and in the developing countries as well. Why I segregate between the developing countries and the developed countries is it that developed countries like North America and even not so developed countries in Latin America, that is South America, the level of urbanization is already 70 to 80%. But when we come to India, the urbanization level or percentage of population living in urban areas is just between 30 to 35%. So the urbanization is increasing. But one of the, I would say, perplexing things in India is that the rural-urban population percentages has almost remained the same.
Very true.
Urban population has increased, and therefore the higher, because you start from a higher base from rural areas, and even though there is migration, the urban population is increasing, yet the percentages remain the same.
About 20%, in fact.
And what challenge it has brought is that given the high percentage of people in rural areas, quite often we have neglected looking at the urban areas. And this challenge is that we haven't anticipated the challenges of urbanization, we haven't prepared for the challenges of urbanization, and we have just been trying to catch up with the problems of urbanization. Somehow, here in India, we always thought that urban areas give problems. They have only problems. There are problems of slums, there are problems of mobility, there are problems of sanitation. Let's manage the problems.
Basic services and
basic services. And we almost thought that can we keep the rural population in the rural areas and let them not migrate to urban areas.
All our schemes have pointed towards, particularly prior to liberalization, were focused on controlling migration.
But the reality is we have failed.
That's right.
Not only failed over here, but the good thing is that we have recognized now that urban areas require much greater attention than what we have ever provided them in terms of planning, in terms of managing, in terms of governance, in terms of finance, in terms of housing. So urban areas require a much greater attention than what we have given to them in the past. And finally, and that is interesting, almost 80% in globally, the GDP is coming from urban areas. About 70% are living in urban areas. About same amount of, I would say, greenhouse gases, pollution is coming from urban areas.
And urban is not even mentioned in the national contribution.
Absolutely,
You know,
absolutely.
it's a glaring gap there, in fact. Yes.
And the land area, urban is just 2 to 3% of the rural areas that is spread all over.
Right.
So urban areas are your engines of growth now. And the point is that not only in India, but even globally, we fail to recognize. When Agenda 21 took place, after the conference in Rio, where sustainable development was pushed forward, urbanization was not an issue. When the Millennium Development Goals were formulated, urbanization was not an issue. They only talked about improvement in slums, not urbanization. Only now in Sustainable Development Goals, you have SDG 11, which focuses on sustainable urbanization, which making cities inclusive, safe, livable, and sustainable. So the whole focus globally has changed. Focus in India has changed because you see it now as an engine of growth, something that can be manageable. And therefore, if you want to make life sustainable, if you want to improve your carbon footprint, you have no option but to focus on urban areas. So urban management, where it has given us a lot of growth, yet it has given us challenges of managing the carbon footprint and sustainability in urban areas.
I couldn't agree more with you. And it's really an honor to have you with us to share these insights because you've held positions at the highest levels of government across the world. And if you could share a little bit more from your experience on how you think we can manage this process of urbanization better while anticipating the challenges and various kinds of risks that we're certainly bound to confront given climate change, which is sort of intertwined with a whole range of other problems that we are facing in our cities today, be they questions of economic growth or environmental sustainability to jobs. There's just a whole range of other problems that are juxtaposed on climate change, which sort of now make the problem very wicked for us. So from your experience, if you could please share how we can anticipate and manage these challenges of providing basic services to our cities in a more informed way.
No, these challenges are really emerging, you're right. And as I said, urban governance, urban planning, municipal finance, implementation of these finance, anticipating the challenges, preparing in advance, all these become important. I just want to share an anecdote. I was in Nairobi in the UN campus, and we had a visit from the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, who was visiting Kenya. And one of the norms are that when you visit that country, Kenya, you also come to plant a tree at the UN campus in Nairobi, which is a very green campus. And so he had come, and so I told him that was sometime in June, July. So I said that, look, we have this Habitat 3 in Quito in October. I hope you are going to join. He said, let's see. But then he said, you know, I was the mayor of Istanbul when Habitat 2 took place. I said, yes, I know. And that's why I'm requesting you to come to Habitat 3. And then his next question was, oh, what has happened to the Secretary General of that Habitat 2? I said, he must have retired. But I was astounded by his memory. He said, but he wasn't that old. He was an African gentleman from Gambia. The reason why I'm bringing this is that the president of Turkey, so powerful, so much of influence, still remembered his time as mayor of Istanbul, who had become president of the country. The current US ambassador in India is a former mayor of Los Angeles. The mayors of North America, both US and Canada, they're a set of very powerful people, very influential people, politically, and they have a lot of capacity to do changes to these cities. We are still aspiring to be one.
Absolutely.
So in terms of the political hierarchy, we still have a long way to go to ensure that the city governance is given the importance that it deserves. While we did have the 74th Amendment, which tended to devolve a lot of powers and responsibilities to urban governance, to municipal governance. But over the years that we have seen, it hasn't added the authority and power, financial or otherwise, to the mayors of the various cities in the country.
That's right.
So urban governance is still a big issue. That is number one. Number two, I find that, again, as I said, that because you have your more than 60% of population in the rural areas, we almost see rural urban as a dichotomous choice, when the reality is the rural and urban have to be more and more combined. So there is now a thinking that not talk of urban, but talk of peri-urban, so involves the rural areas surrounding it. So that kind of comprehensive planning, somehow we need to increase more. You know, if you recall that one of the first commissions on urbanization was set up in 1987.
Right.
That was led by a very distinguished architect, Charles Correa.
Yes.
Now, in our constitution, urban development is a state subject.
That's right.
And therefore not so much concerned with the central government. But the states are always, they find the finances to be in a challenging situation. And therefore, whenever you have a challenge between urban and rural, they find it easier to manage or balance, and they don't have so much for the urban areas. So the first commission, we have 87 in Charles Correa. The recommendations were made. Have you heard what happened to those recommendations? Very little. Then we have the 74th Amendment in 1992. It goes on. Again, nothing much happens. Till suddenly you find that the present government, which it came in 2014, it came up with any number of city-focused development schemes. Your 100 smart cities. You had your urban Swachhata, that taking place. Of course, the previous government did bring in the Jawaharlal Nehru urban mission, which was amalgamated in Amrut Atal mission. So you have a slight shifting of focus from rural to urban. I wouldn't say shifting, a kind of rebalancing. And therefore, we still find that our slums are still challenging. Urban housing is still a big challenge. Managing urban mobility is still a challenge. We have an existing city. We can't build new cities that often. But as we go for urban expansion, how do we fuse the two? That the housing and workplaces are more combined, easily accessible. You have public transportation. So these are challenges. People recognize it. You know, the simple thing is that it's not rocket science. Everyone knows what's the problem of a city. Everyone who lives in a city knows. I can't go out, I have congestion, mobility is difficult, I can't breathe, environment is bad. You have large number of rural migrants in urban areas, they can't find housing. Everyone knows the problem. But tackling them, one, you have to tackle them for today, you need to tackle them for tomorrow, and you have to tackle them 5 years, 10 years down the line. So you have immediate problems, you have mid-term problems, you have long-term problems, and you need to balance the three. So the planning that we need to do is in terms of both for the immediate term, where the people are already living in slums, then anticipate, because we are going to have more urbanization, more people are going to migrate, the jobs are in urban areas, the better paying jobs are in urban areas, and therefore, whether we like it or not, we may want to dissuade rural migrants to come into urban areas. We can't. So they will come. So we need to have a planning. And again, apart from planning, the challenge is implementation.
Both, in fact, such valuable points. Thank you very much, Mr. Mishra. This leads us to two other critical questions that are facing us. One is the idea of planning itself, because there's a substantial shift, there's a fundamental shift that is taking place in the idea of planning in India. There's post-independence, we had a much more socialist idea of planning. There was 5-year plans, which meant to translate into state-level 5-year plans and then to urban and rural territories. But post-liberalization, and particularly now, as I mentioned earlier as well, over the last 10 years or so, we've had greater emphasis on looking at a whole range of agile instruments that can be used to accomplish outcomes as opposed to this long-term planning. But we have the problem of climate change, which requires us to actually work towards particular kinds of outcomes. Our planning regime so far has not focused on outcomes-driven decision-making, outcomes-driven regulations. For example, our regulatory frameworks are very technical. Planning has been very technocratically driven as opposed to having political accountabilities. So one challenge ahead of us is now to combine this agile instruments that has been in the discourse and practice spaces at central government levels as well as state government levels in accomplishing these outcomes, but also in terms of mechanisms, to devise mechanisms which will allow the government to partner with the private sector, to partner with civil society organizations, because as you rightly mentioned, the problem is everybody's. The problem is not just the states, but it's also equally the communities. Air pollution is as much produced and felt by people as much as it is by private sector companies. So we need to think about instruments which can bring all of these institutions together, state, market, as well as a society. Your thoughts on how we can actually build these better partnerships would be extremely valuable to have. If you could share some insights, please.
One of the things, once upon a time, I even did a brief summer job in Planning Commission. It was a big organization. Of course, that was on industrial area. The thing is that what we do need in India is much more work at the ground level, at the municipal level, at the town level.
To strengthen municipal
To strengthen
governments.
the planning and the competence and the technical and the civil society inputs at the ground level. That is something we are missing. For urban governance and management, the erstwhile Planning Commission was just too far. And as I mentioned, as it was still, urban management was a state subject, the inputs from central government was much less. It was more in terms of financial support, guidance, balancing it out. So that was different. So we need to improve the municipal governance, both politically, financially, and in terms of deliverables. Hold them accountable at the municipal level, and much greater involvement of the stakeholders and the civil society, whether it's educational institutions, the knowledge input from universities and places like yours, or in terms of technical from other architects, town planners, or the private sector who have a stake in that city. Their employees are working over there, their employees are living over there, or even if they have the production facilities, etc., they are producing. And mind you, they are the people who are maybe doing some emissions, the carbon footprints, the mobility. So they are the people who are going to bring in. So your much bigger level of urban planning, you have to do it at the ground level, at the municipal governance level. So this is absolutely basic. Of course, that has to be matched by financial resources. And that's where the public-private partnership comes in. Right. That only when the private sector, government sometimes is like a black box. We have very little information, very little is put out. They say that everything is on the website, quite often the details are missing. And therefore, you have to invite and bring in the private sector, where there you'll get input in terms of knowledge. That's where you'll get them help in terms of how they can work together and how can public partnership can be joined together in making the city life better. So first and foremost is better sort of more ground level planning at the urban level. Now you have to give them much bigger, I would say, responsibilities. Quite often, most of the municipal bodies are only looking up to the state government to finance everything. Yes. They can't even pay all their employees. So even for employees' payment, they have to look at the state government grants. And therefore, how do we either make it automatic? Of course, we have now the State Finance Commission, which actually devolves money to them. And you also have the Central Finance Commission, who also give out money. So you have to restructure municipal governance in terms of municipal responsibilities, municipal planning, bring in the private sector on one hand, and bring in the knowledge sector as well.
Yes, multiple types of partnerships.
Because one of the things that you see that in an office, even if you have 100 people in government, they are doing the routine stuff. They are not adding knowledge. They are not learning. They don't know what's happening outside. And that is something that you need to bring in. So much greater importance at the municipal level, much bigger responsibility at the municipal level, and really getting them to reach out to the private sector, to the civil society, to the knowledge centers, universities, to make a good plan and share it with others and get input from the citizens. Quite often we find an easy way out. Oh, we have made resident welfare associations, they will give us inputs. Now, RWAs give inputs. Who cares whether they are listened to it or not? So much more open system of planning, much more involvement, I'm sure would go a much longer way in making our cities more livable, because that's where we want it to be. As the slogan of SDG 11 is, which is already ongoing, and our government as a country is committed to it, into making our cities safe, livable, resilient and sustainable.
I couldn't agree more with you on strengthening local governments and local governance, particularly in the urban realm, where, as you rightly pointed out, the wicked problem of, the 74th Amendment, implementation of the 74th Amendment, and it's essentially a political problem. On that note, I would like to share some insights of my own from my experiences having co-led the development plan for Greater Mumbai. This was in between 2011 and 2015. We were consultants. I was part of this firm called Aegis India, which is an engineering consultancy firm. And the Municipal Corporation for Greater Mumbai had appointed us to prepare the plan with the Municipal Corporation for Greater Mumbai. Excellent experience in terms of addressing, cartelization of real estate markets, for instance, and how they had embedded themselves into the regulatory regimes in the past plan. We sort of went about dismantling that with high-level guidance from Mr. Phatak, who was also part of the Commission for Urbanization and, with Charles Correa's leadership, with Mr. Charles Correa's leadership. And that effort, it was about 4 years of planning, where we had a whole range of public workshops across the 4 years time period. But at the end of it, the government, state government, scrapped the plan within literally 4 weeks of the draft plan being published. And one of the core problems there is the lack of accountabilities, both from the business communities. The real estate markets and other entangled markets, financial markets, for instance, are very much intertwined with real estate as well as the construction industry. So there was no representation really from the business communities, and there was no political commitment to the nature of shifts we were bringing into the plan to sort of dismantle some of the older, regulatory capture that we saw in the earlier development plan. So yes, I think we sort of really need to move towards ecosystem capacity building, where we recognize that all of these problems we face is not just the problem of the state, but it's as much the problem of businesses and the civil society and communities and people who inhabit cities, not just those who have domicile status in cities, but also migrants, and everyone needs to become part of decision making so that plans don't remain just supply-led spaces which become sort of respond to demand on the ground, and also be amenable to change as we move along. The plans should be sort of more flexible. They're very rigid today. They need to become much more flexible, perhaps, and all communities involved, and as you rightly mentioned, in terms of partnerships, multiple partnership arrangements would need to be crafted carefully so that all parties or partners involved in these partnership arrangements are committed to accomplishing those goals. And a huge problem there is that the partners who would be involved are not necessarily aligned on their values and goals. The private sector is motivated to profit making, the public sector, the state is motivated to accomplishing its welfareist agendas. And so the challenge for public policy professionals such as all of us would be to sort of get these misaligned actors to speak to one another. I think, would you agree?
No, absolutely. And the other challenge is we need to move at a much greater speed than what we have done. Mm-hmm. Look at Mumbai. Right. Look at redevelopment of Dharavi. I don't know, from decades people have been talking about it. Now, some movement is being seen. So in this whole discussion and others and political power play, urbanization, the positive aspects of urban management sometimes gets delayed. And we don't have the luxury of delaying or meeting the challenges of urbanization. Of course, we have an opportunity because we don't have the levels of urbanization which many other countries have seen. So we still have time. But our rural hinterland has given us opportunity in terms of time for urban management, but urbanization has to move, or urban management has to move at a much faster pace, a kind of a measured pace that we see a better urban space for our kids and others, for generations next, a more sustainable kind of cities. And of course, Lavanya has lived in Singapore.
Yes.
And she has lived in a city-state which has managed sustainability and livability very nicely. So maybe she can share some of her insights from Singapore.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Yes, I was just moving to solicit your thoughts, Lavanya.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's very exciting. So taking from where Sir left off, I think our policies in some sense are not visionary in nature. What I've seen in a city-state country like Singapore, they're very well prepared to take on the challenges that may come from 10, 20 years from now. They are a highly densely populated nation. They're water stressed, but look at their ways of conserving water. They have desalination plants, they have reservoirs, they conserve rainwater like anything. And they do not have to rely on other people to do so. They are so visionary in their nature. Sir mentioned that, it's the delay that keeps happening. If a master plan is prepared, I think half the time just goes in the implementation. They become so rigid, like ma'am, you pointed out. They're not flexible, they're not pragmatic. They're not looking at things 10 years from now, how things are going to be like. And I feel like we are also living in this world where it's just not basic service delivery, it's also climate change. We just came out of a pandemic, and there are going to be multiple challenges going to come about in the coming years. But are we prepared for them? Is our government, are other people prepared to think on those lines? That's what I feel. Singapore has a livability index. They have their own World City Summit that happens every 2 years. So they invite people, yes, and they have these municipal governments, mayors from different countries, from Africa, from Seoul, from North America, coming and visiting Singapore and seeing what the practices they do and the best practices that they have and then they share. So these things are very exciting. And I think India has a lot to learn. Bangalore became very infamous for the water scarcity problem. Delhi is already infamous for the air pollution problem. And it's been happening for quite some time. It's not that it's a 1 or 2 year old problem. Stubble burning happens every year. But what are we doing? Are we making policies that resolve that issue, or are we caught up in something else, So we need to actually think in advance, be prepared to handle these risks much better, I feel. Yeah.
In fact, since you bring up the problem of stubble burning, there was a debate recently online where experts were discussing why air pollution is not a political prerogative, and that's a question to really investigate, I think, both from a research as well as a practice point of view. Why there's not enough political ownership of that problem, across the country, I suppose. But also your work, Lavanya, if I could since I'm familiar with some of the work you've done while you were at Singapore, but also in your previous experience when you were working in India, your work has also been quite a lot in the sphere of data governance. There's this, international institutions, for instance, they argue that data is essential for scientific and informed decision making. But data, in our context for cities, we've explored, for instance, in Bangalore, since we're having this conversation here in Bangalore, I was part of a process in 2003, 4, and 5 where the state government had commissioned setting up a data lab in the Bangalore Development Authority. But that data as an end, the endeavor was to create all of this data repository as an end in itself. And there were several gaps there, and data governance as such didn't really take off. So your insights on what kinds of measures you've explored as part of your work in the sphere of data governance?
Sure, thank you for asking that, ma'am. So we work on a slightly different set of project and data governance. You're looking at healthcare data and how that can be managed. And you're looking at Southeast Asian nations in particular. So what we came across, our studies were mostly centered around Malaysia and Indonesia. And we realized that data is such an important part. And there's so much of data, and healthcare data is very sensitive. So how do you what are the practices that are existing in these countries? Are the government prepared to tackle all these data leakages which might happen, or people are willing to share, people are going to get digital and everything? Malaysia on that front turned out to be slightly more rigid in terms of the governance. They also had a major data breach which happened in their country, and they were like, we're working on it. But on the contrast, Indonesia, being like a rural country like India, was better equipped and much more open to adopting these data governance practices. And we also were working on a project with Kenyan team on the urban data practices, and we looked at how their data is being managed and how municipal governments can use this data to make better informed decision making. And along with that, I think governance is a very important factor, because when you're collecting and storing so much of data, which can lead to better informed decision making, but is our data better protected in those places? And I think Singapore is a great example of that. They have this Global Data Protection Act, which is very stringent, very well protected data systems, and they are a very advanced country in that sense. So yes.
There are cities in India which are quite advanced in establishing data governance regimes. Pune is one of them. I'm familiar that they are taking up very concerted efforts to build a multi-pronged framework for data governance. It's not just creating data, but it's also creating and enabling a set of protocols for multiple departments to be able to share data. That way you can economize on the amount of data you create, because data sharing is also a power relationships problem. Because government authorities recognize that data is power, and they're not willing to share that data with other departments, for instance. So there are very concerted efforts underway, and at the central government level as well, there's the National Data Policy, which has been established, and they're empowering state governments to participate in managing this data very well and allowing that data to inform decision making, which cuts across multiple levels of the government now, because decisions for cities is no longer just taken by the state governments alone, but it's a space of a rescaled state where decisions are taken across multiple levels of the government, and even cities are interacting with international institutions. So there's a much more, it's a different type of decision-making space. And so this data governance processes, which the government of India and state governments have initiated, will certainly give rise to more sort of recognizable streamlining. I believe I'm very optimistic about that. However, there are also debates about, is it data-led decision-making or decision-making which then draws on certain kinds of data sets to sort of make their arguments more widely acceptable by people. And that's a debate which is unresolved, of course. But we must recognize that these debates also exist in the sphere of, political motivations for using data. In terms of health policy, you mentioned data and health. Any insights there that you might want to share? Because health is an area which is grossly under researched as well as sort of neglected in the space of urban policy and governance and planning particularly. Right. Any insights there that you might want to share with us?
Sure. So when you're looking at Malaysia, we realized that hospitals were trying to digitize the sort of data that they were getting, and it's sort of streamlined. So when a patient is visiting one city in one part of Malaysia, if they go to another part, they can easily have the data interoperability to that part of the hospital. So it becomes much more seamless and easy. That was the idea of our project to be done. And we're sort of assisting Microsoft in achieving and scaling this project. When we came to Indonesia, we had a different sort of problem. There was this rural, major chunk of population living in rural areas. Second were the digitally literate to sort of be, and then the third is the equipments. Do they have the sort of financial resources to be able to resort to the data governance and digitization healthcare data? And health definitely is a very important thing, and everybody requires good healthcare facilities. And they have sort of attained a level of basic healthcare delivery service in the remotest part of the country, but still, it's still a far-fetched thing to have everything digital, because if a doctor is doing everything digitally, they need to spend extra time to do it. And that there's this conversion time that takes place. So you need time, you need to capacitate the doctors to actually get equipped with these things. So there's multiple processes that sort of need to take place. And if a patient is coming, are they comfortable in sharing everything? Are they okay with their data being stored and being sort of shared with another hospital? Is that okay for them? And if it's a sensitive disease, are they okay sharing with another hospital? So all of these questions sort of prop up, and then a lot of explore in this area, I feel. So not just data governance, it's also healthcare, like you said, ma'am. It's very important to be explored more.
Thank you. That's certainly very important in looking at data and healthcare. But I was also referring to healthcare as a whole in terms of the policy focus as well as focus in planning spheres. In the space of urban planning, for instance, planning legislation at the state government level does not really include social. It's become referred to much more as sectors now. We don't look at health for life as such. We need to start looking at health for life, life for health, and a much broader sort of imagination of well-being, as Mr. Mishra was mentioning as well. Over to you, Mr. Mishra, for any thoughts on that front.
No, one thing about India, we say India is not a country, it's a subcontinent. And if you really look at it, India is a huge mosaic. Of course, we talk in terms of culture, the language, the heritage, and everything. But even in terms of the urban scenario, you look at the southern part of the country, where in states it has already reached 40 to 50% of urban areas. Right. Look at Bihar, it's still 10%. Maybe Bihar is sending more migrants to many of these states to urban areas than what it already has. So you have one set which is already looking at 40 to 50% of urbanization. There is another set which is only looking at 10% of urbanization. You have these huge municipalities, whether it's Bangalore or Chennai or Delhi or Mumbai, And then you have these very smaller municipalities, notified area committees or Nagar Panchayats,
Yes.
which has much less population.
Yes. In fact, Uttar Pradesh, a colleague of mine was recently mentioning that they have about 700 cities which they have shortlisted now. These are Nagar Panchayats as well as small towns, which have no data at all whatsoever. And they obviously don't have plans. But you're right. I think there's such a disparity of size of cities that we have to tackle.
So there is no one size fits all.
Right.
And that we need to be conscious of. Quite often, when we talk of India, we talk of country as one country. But there are so multiple challenges. So when you're looking at urban areas, when you're looking at urban planning, urban sort of building up capacity of planning, you need to deal with from Mumbai to that small Nagar Panchayat that you talk of in Uttar Pradesh or in Bihar, which are more extensions of the rural hinterland and supporting the rural hinterland rather than to be independent urban cities.
Yes.
With its own economy, with its own dynamics, with its own challenges. And therefore, that is something we need to be conscious of. And the next thing is, so one is the mosaic, the variety. Second is the timeline. We need to run. Like Alice said in Wonderland, you have to be running even to be in the same place.
And
But
twice as fast.
Twice as fast. But here we have challenges of urbanization, which is running so fast. So we need to be faster, we anticipate more, do more. So we have the challenges before us. We know it, we just got to do it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mishra, for joining us on this very important conversation about urbanization and the challenges of urbanization in India. It's really been an honor to have you here with us. Thank you very much, Lavanya. Your insights as someone who's has experience in other countries, and you've shared your insights on how we can look at multiple forms of exchange of knowledge across the countries has been very important and wonderful to engage with as well. I was, sort of trying to bring together the multiple insights that you brought onto this conversation from, questions about the size of cities, the disparity of cities in terms of the size and scale of cities that we have in terms of challenges that we face, basic services, strengthening municipal governments, the question of the idea of planning, how do we combine outcomes-driven planning with greater political commitment at the local government levels as well, devolution of powers to municipal governments, both fiscal as well as political capacities, but also the concept of ecosystem capacities. The problems that we confront are not just that of the state, but also of businesses, of civil society, of communities, inhabitants of cities. And then the question of, how do we garner data and information to inform a more demand-driven planning process and data governance as a whole, as opposed to just data creation as technology innovation, because just technical solutions are not going to suffice. We need to look at much more, people-oriented people-oriented technologies as well, and innovation. So that was wonderful to hear. And finally, the emphasis on the health sector and looking at, cities as life and life in cities as a much broader framework within which we need to anticipate uncertainties and gear ourselves up for risks twice as fast. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.